Prophetically gifted, supernaturally bold, and oddly depressed. Today we take a look at one of the most iconic prophets in the Bible to discover the man behind the story and what we can learn from him. Joining me around the table is no stranger to table talk, John Paul Jackson. How are you?
Great.
And you're dear friends with our special guest and actually wrote the foreword to the book we're going to talk about.
Yes, I did, and it was my honor to do so.
Well, we're glad you're here as always. April Simons.
Hey there.
How are you?
I am doing super.
We always love to learn about so many different subjects. It's always interesting to have R.T. Kendall here, isn't it?
It's going to be good.
And Cindy Murdoch, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. I'm excited about this. It's an amazing book.
And one of my favorite people, yes, you can write that down, R.T. Kendall, Dr. R.T. Kendall, welcome.
Well, let's get that in there.
Absolutely, for sure, for sure. Well, in his book, These Are the Days of Elijah, renowned author and minister, Dr. R.T. Kendall, gives a dynamic look at one of the Bible's best known yet often misunderstood prophets. And the man he reveals is one we can all relate to. So, Dr. Kendall, let's talk about this book, which, by the way, I believe is one of your best books.
Thank you.
I endorse this book, in fact. These Are the Days of Elijah. As you were writing this book, what was it that really jumped out at you as far as Elijah is concerned and as it relates to the modern day prophet today?
Well, James says, James 5:17, he was just like us. And that is so true. When you get past his famous reputation and the power that was demonstrated on Mount Carmel, but just get to the man, he was so ordinary. And he was
it's hard for us to think that, because all we think about is the calling fire down.
I'm going to tell you, when you read my book, you will, in fact, a lot of people probably think, oh, you shouldn't say that about Elijah. I'm going to tell you, he was so human. And he took himself so seriously.
He did.
You wonder why God would use a man. I mean, he had the biggest ego. You say, oh, no, not Elijah. Yes, I tell you, he had a huge ego.
So I wanted to ask you before you even said that about the ego, did you find any, because we know you don't have that, but any qualities about Elijah that you could relate to?
All of them.
I knew he was going to say that.
I mean, I hate to admit it, but I have a problem with that too.
I think we all do at times. Well,
if I'm totally honest, my greatest weakness is I take myself too seriously. I know that's my weakness. And so I think, oh, I've got to be sorted out before God can use me. But then when I think, he took a long time to sort out Elijah. Take, for example, here's Elijah on Mount Carmel. He challenges the prophets of Baal. And just before he calls fire down from heaven, he says, I alone am left. God could have said, stop, call off the whole proceedings. We can't go on. That's not true, Elijah. You know it. I know it. How dare you say that? Because Elijah knew better. I mean, the day before, he was with Obadiah, and who had hid 100 prophets in caves. Elijah wasn't the only one, but you see, he began to think he was the one that mattered, and he exaggerated his importance. And the fact is that God didn't stop the proceedings, just let him go on. And then later on, when he had Elijah all by himself, he said, Elijah, oh, by the way, you're not the only one. And I think of how God has used me over the years, and there were so many faults, and I was so unwise, and yet God used me. And then later on, he says, R.T., I need to talk to you about something. God is like that. He lets us save face. So Elijah, he's just like us.
I love that. Now, John Paul, you wrote the foreword to this.
Right.
So I'm going to let you be a true co-host today and ask your question about These Are the Days of Elijah of your friend, Dr. Kendall.
Well, R.T., I think it'd be really good for you to tell people about there's an ecstatic nature of Elijah and the human nature of Elijah, and God used Elijah in absolute clear-cut prophetic words. I mean, here's a guy who said, it's not going to rain here till the words come out of my mouth. And so, and that happened. So how do you look at that? He's on one hand, he's running from Jezebel, and then on the other hand, he says, I can control nature.
Okay. Well, I bring out a theological truth that, to be honest, I don't know of anybody else that teaches this. I could be wrong. I could be like Elijah. I alone have taught this. And then God may say, oh, I can tell you a lot of books on this. But it's the difference between the promise and the oath. You see, I can give you a promise, but then you say, R.T., how can I believe this? And I say, I swear this is true. Why would I say I swear? I'm afraid you won't believe the promise, so I have to use stronger language. And the oath is stronger. That's what Hebrews 6 says. The oath is stronger. It leaves no argument. God does that with us. He relates to us at the level of promise. And if it's a promise, it's usually based on condition. I will do such and such if you do this. And so a promise may not come to pass. It depends on the condition that we fulfill it. But if God swears an oath, it's over. Nothing can stop it. He himself won't take it back. And he can swear an oath in mercy, and he can swear an oath in wrath. He swore in his wrath against Israel that they would not enter his rest. And there's nothing that get him to enter God's rest. And if he swears in his mercy, it's done. And when God communicates to us at that level, we know without any doubt it's true. And that's the reason Elijah could have this authority. Goes up to King Ahab and said, you might like to know, it won't rain till I say so. How could he be so calm? I mean, after he leaves, he might think, oh dear, what have I said? Oh, please, Lord, don't let it rain. And he has to live like that for 3 years.
Yeah.
Calm as he can be, at home, because he was living at the level of the oath. And this is a teaching I think will encourage a lot of people. And the book of Hebrews is written to encourage Christians to believe that God will swear an oath to you.
Wow.
And if he swears an oath to you, you have a level of assurance that you did not know you could have in this life. And so my book deals with that teaching, the promise, the oath, and how God can speak to us at an oath level. That's the reason Elijah had this authority.
So I'm thinking about a court of law, where you are under oath.
That's right.
And you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help your God.
Yeah, it's because the oath is stronger.
Yeah.
The President of the United States, one hand on the Bible, raising the hand, because you want to believe him.
Yeah.
And yet even God will do that. And of course, he swears by himself because there's no greater.
So, April and Cindy, you guys get ready with the question, but before you do, let's talk a little bit about the atmosphere in the day of Elijah, and let's kind of, if we can, parallel it with what we're seeing today in the world.
Well, we think today is the worst it's ever been, and there's a case can be made that it's just that, the worst ever. But the encouraging thing is that Ahab was the most evil king that ever was, the worst. And it was the worst possible situation. I think I say this in the book. John Wesley wrote in his diary, in his journal, he had just been in the northeast of England, around Newcastle, and he said, today I never heard such swearing and such profanity, such blasphemy. And then he wrote, ripe for revival. And I want to say that when it looks the worst and we think it can't get worse, I say, look up, your redemption draws nigh. That's when God loves to step in and surprise everybody.
That's good.
If we compare like we are today and what's going on in the world, and how Elijah, as a man of God, was able to speak forth the oath of God to a man or a king in power. And he had to live through it. Elijah had to live through the same thing with no rain that everybody else did. But then when it came the day to say, when he was cutting up the calves and saying, pour more water on, when water was almost not even around. I mean, it was such a precious thing. Pour more water on. And I think my heart was like, God, I want to see today, in the world we live today, these Elijahs that can do that before leaders and people in high places that have a lot to do with what goes on in the country. What does it take for those of us that are in humanity, or just human, just like Elijah, to hear that word of God and that oath that could change?
What it doesn't take is that we're supermen. Elijah was no Superman. He was ordinary. And that's the most encouraging thing. At the spiritual level, however, I think what it takes is that God trusts us with this kind of communication. If he trusts you, that he would swear an oath to you, that's the highest compliment God can give us. And if God could swear an oath to us, we know it's going to happen. Then we would have authority. It won't be a case of thinking, I hope this will happen.
Right.
I mean, authority. And this is what the church, forgive me, doesn't seem to have at the moment. Who do you know today that's afraid of the church? What church do you know that's turning the world upside down and causes the community all around to be scared to death? Nobody. But
They're
it
not
takes
afraid
an
of the
Elijah
church, yeah.
to come along.
Right.
And yet he himself was ordinary. So we must never think, if God were to raise up somebody like that, that they're Superman or super pious. Not true. Ordinary people, and yet they have a relationship with God. You know, the funny thing is we don't know anything about his background. Not a word. He comes in a boat out of the blue. He's just called Elisha the Tishbite. That's all we know.
Yeah.
The thing is, you don't have to have a reputation to precede you if you want to have a voice.
Great
If you've got authority, it speaks for itself. And they won't ask, who have you got? Who are you that you could talk like that? What are your credentials? Tell us more. Not necessary. If you've got that authority, they're going to listen. That's what is needed more than anything in the world.
That's awesome. You know, I want to go a little bit back in the story. Elijah told Ahab that it wasn't going to rain, and then God takes him to a brook. And he's there, and the ravens feed him. Then his brook dries up. And I know for a lot of us out there, our brook dries up, and we don't know how to step forward. So what would you say to people that their brook's dried up, there's nothing there, no more birds are coming to us? How do we move forward?
Well, God doesn't lead us from A to Z, but from A to B, B to C. And even Elijah now was affected by his own prophecy. There was a
Right.
famine in the land. Now he isn't sure how he's going to make it.
Right.
But the thing is, the surprising ways that God supplies our need. He does it in a way you would never have thought of. Takes me back to when I was pastor of a church in Carlisle, Ohio, a little church there where they didn't like my ministry very much, and they tried to get rid of me. They got a petition to get me out, and they got it, well, by one vote, we stayed in, but people withheld their tithes, and the church treasurer came to me and said, Brother Kendall, we're not going to be able to pay your salary anymore. And I never will forget one morning, Louise and I woke up, said, I can't make it through the day, honey. I said, I don't know how we're going to make it. We have no money in the bank, no gas in the car. We got a letter in the mail, a check for $25. That was pure gold. And the couple said, I woke up yesterday and the Lord said, send RT $25. I didn't even know those people knew where we were. Wow. I would never have dreamed that. And it taught me a lesson. God has a way of supplying your need in the way you would never dream. So with Elijah, fed by the ravens. God is never too late. He's never too early. He's always just on time.
So it's interesting that today it's almost like the world is giving us more supernatural moments than the church is. I mean, Elijah lived a supernatural life and that God used him in dramatic ways. Are we going to see that again? Are there going to be men and women of God that are going to step to the forefront?
I believe so. In fact, after reading the manuscript of RT's, I was more convinced than ever. When you have the understanding that ordinary people can have an extraordinary relationship with God, and that from that relationship comes authority. We really do need authority. We look for power, but Elijah walked in an authority of God. He's one of two men that saw the back part of God. Moses and Elijah both saw the back part of God.
Yeah.
And that was because there was a relationship that was there. Another thing I love about RT's book is that he paints a man who can have a relationship with God and gives me hope that I can have a relationship with God just like that. And if we have a relationship with our God, the only God, we have that kind of relationship, we'll walk in that type of authority. And then when God says, say this, we don't even think about it. It just comes out our mouth. And that gives me hope. RT's book gives me hope. And I think every pastor, every leader, and especially everyone who thinks they have any little bit of prophetic gifting whatsoever should read this book and digest it.
So after you wrote the book, RT, did you think that you were going to have a few or more bolder moments where you would step out and say and do things that you felt like the Lord's leading you to say, where maybe you would have hesitated in the past?
That's a good question. I guess I'm supposed to say yes and answer that question. But I only know that I have had one or two occasions, I can't say I've had 15 or 20, but one or two when God swore an oath to me. I do know what that is like. And when that happens, you're set, at least for that moment.
Well, open doors to speak to world leaders. I can think of a lot of Elijah moments that you've had in your ministry.
Well, I'm not even thinking of that. I'm just thinking of authority. There's a Greek word, pleraphoria. It means full assurance. It's the highest level of knowing God that you can get. And he also talks about full assurance of understanding, where you know theologically you've got it right. And that's important, to know theologically you have got it right. When you have that, you've got an authority. And I long for the day that I will have an open door. And maybe, Joni, you're going to help give it to me today.
Well, you have it today, but I can think of an incident when we won't talk about in detail, but there was a major so-called revival, and you stood up and spoke the truth concerning it. That was definitely...
Well, yes, when everybody under the sun said the great revival has come, and there's a major magazine that had 10 articles on it, and they're all saying this is, this is of God. But to their credit, they had me write one, and I said, it's not of God. It's not of God. Oh, don't say that, RT. I said, it's not of God. Well, just say it might not have. I said, it's not of God. How can you be so sure? I said, I can tell you why. First of all, never in my lifetime have I seen such an opportunity to reach the gospel, reach the world with the gospel. I mean, they were carrying this man live on TV. It was going into Iraq, into China. And it's the first time that world would ever hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. How many times do you suppose that man preached the gospel? I listened to him night after night after night after night. Not once. Am I to believe that the great revival has come, is going to reach the world, and the man doesn't even preach the gospel? You see, Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation. They were not interested in salvation. They were talking about words of knowledge and demonstration to get people all excited. And I said, it's not of God. Well, turns out later that people came around and said, well, you were right. You know why they thought I was right? Because the man was living with his secretary in a trailer right behind the auditorium the whole time. Now they think it's not of God. I said, that shouldn't have been what convinced you. I said, if it was completely moral and not preaching the gospel, and to call this revival, it's not possible that it's of God.
There's the boldness of Elijah right there.
This man has,
is that true?
Man has boldness. I
There
have
you
watched
go.
him.
There we go. Well, we have to take a short break, but we'll be right back with more from Dr. R.T. Kendall right after this. Surrounded by enemies and difficult circumstances, the prophet Elijah had moments of bold courage and other moments of absolute fear and depression, not unlike each of us. So today we're looking at this dynamic man and how he mirrors all of us. Dr. Kendall, why is it so important that we understand the human side of Elijah? Thank God, it really helps me out.
Otherwise, we'll become disillusioned with ourselves and say, oh, I thought I knew the Lord, and if I really knew the Lord, I wouldn't feel like this, and I feel so ashamed. And a lot of
all
people,
of us have felt like that in ministry, haven't we?
Well, yes, and Elijah went into a pretty deep depression. I mean, he was in bad shape. And in one day, he's challenging the prophets of Baal. In fact, it's a party. He says, shout louder. He's having fun with them because he was so sure that God was going to step in. But the next day, because of Jezebel, who swore an oath, and that's what got him, because he knew she's going to keep that oath. And he was terrified. He ran for his life. And you would think this same man who was so powerful the day before is now like a child, scared. We're all like this.
We are.
Let's say it. Let's admit it. Quit playing a game and say we're so pious and strong. We're all ordinary people. And that was Elijah. And that's why he's one of my heroes.
I love that. So what about the depression? What did it say to you as you read through that part of the book?
Well, it came face to face with reality. Not many men of God will admit, or women of God will admit, that after an incredible high where God uses you in spectacular ways, maybe in a supernatural experience or in a way where you see the Spirit of God doing life-changing things, then all of a sudden you come down and you're not on that high anymore. You're not on that spiritual level at that anymore. And all of a sudden you realize this could happen to me. Or you feel lonely. There's a spiritual loneliness that can happen. And if you end up running, then you end up actually complicating the spiritual loneliness and making it worse. And Elijah made it worse on himself.
So what would you say, RT, to those that are watching right now and you love God, you're serving God, but you're just in that slump of depression and just feeling so alone?
There is a purpose in it. It is ordained of God. What Elijah was going through in that depression, he couldn't have known it at the time. God was preparing him for the next phase of his own relationship with God. Not that there would be another Mount Carmel experience. That was one-off. That was a high water mark of the whole Bible in a sense, or at least the Old Testament, I should say. But now God wanted to show something to Elijah that it would never preach. He could never use it. But he says, what's wrong, Elijah? Oh, he said, I'm very zealous. I alone am left. And he starts crying. And God says, go stand in the cave. I'm going to show you something. Comes the wind, the fire, the earthquake. These are ways that were very predictable. You think, that's the way God's going to show up. God wanted to show up to Elijah in a way that Elijah had never seen before. There came a gentle whisper, still small voice, it says in the King James Version, and Elijah knew, this is God. I wouldn't have thought it. And God wants to show us things that we hadn't thought of before. He wants to do what is unprecedented, what is unpredictable. And it might be just for you, not because you want to tell it to the world, but because God loves you as a person. And that should encourage anybody that's in depression at this moment. God's not finished with you yet, and He has something to show you, and you'll never be the same again.
So you mentioned a low moment in ministry for you early on where I guess the people, the board members were turning against you, this small church, and weren't paying you a salary, and literally you were, out there in the desert and God was providing.
Well, Joni, that wasn't the last time that happened. That happened in a little town in Carlisle, Ohio, population probably 300.
Yeah.
What about when you're in a population of 10 million and you're a pastor of one of the most prominent churches in the world, Westminster Chapel, and half your deacons turn against you and accuse you of false teaching?
Wow.
And my ministry was at stake. And if they had their way, they would have thrown me out on the streets. But God came through. But that was a very low moment. I never will forget the night they were taking the vote, and they were going to have the vote. And it looked like the opposition was going to win. And I looked back at Louise. She looked at me, and I thought, this is it. This is it. In that moment, to my right, wasn't a vision, but it was almost. It was like a pillar of fire just to my right. And I heard a voice, do not lean on your own understanding, just trust me. And do you know what? Within 5 minutes, everything reversed. And the night that the church was supposed to get rid of me, the church got rid of them. And we survived, and my ministry went on, and I stayed 25 years at Westminster Chapel. As Charles Dickens put it, it was the best of times and the worst of times.
That's amazing. But you think about those early experiences even prepared you for this huge
Yes.
mammoth experience that would take place.
Jesus said, he that is faithful in that which is least will be faithful in much. And all that we're going through, whether it's the depression or you wonder how God's going to supply your need, it's his way of saying, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you.
I love it. We were out of time. John Paul, who needs to read the book? These are the days of Elijah.
Everybody.
Everybody.
Everybody. No, truly, truly. You learn so much about your own self. I believe God has given RT insight into those who really want to follow after God and the things that God will allow them to go through in order to get them to a higher place in him.
And especially, I mean, I think this is for everyone, but those of you that you prophetically, you know, you
Yes,
have a gift. I think this
especially.
is a must read for you, for sure. These are the days of Elijah. Be sure and pick that up. Well, we're out of time. I want to thank Dr. Kendall for joining us at the table. Be sure to pick up his book again, the title, These Are the Days of Elijah. It's available now. And for more, you can visit him online at rtkendallministries.com. Remember that no matter what you're facing today, God cares about every need in your life. You can call the number on your screen. We have prayer partners that are standing by ready to pray with you. You're not alone today, so be encouraged from what you've heard. Don't forget to join the conversation online by leaving us a comment on Facebook or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, bye-bye for today.